Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, as we are reminded that you are one, we ask that you continue to help us in our work to be one, to love one another fully, and to be one body, to live out your purposes in the world. Amen. So as I talked about with the kids just now, our first reading today from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, is it contains a prayer which in Judaism is known as the Shema. It comes from the first word in Hebrew, which is Shema, and it's a simple prayer. Shema Israel, Adonai Elohim, Adonai Echad. That's the prayer. And of course it continues with the commandment to love God with everything that we have, essentially. With all of our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength. That just means with everything. And the Shema is supposed to be everywhere in life. It's supposed to be as you're living, as you're waking up, as you're going to bed. It's Echad is supposed to be the last word to pass your lips as you die, if you are a particularly observant Jewish person. It's supposed to be the last prayer that you say at the end of your life, the prayer you say over your children, and then some people, as we may have seen, bind it literally in a phylactery to their head, or bind it literally to their hand. Or people will have a phylactery over their doorway, over their doorposts, or on the lintels, hang it on the wall. So it's incredibly important that we have this reminder that God is our God and that God is one, and also that we are to love God with everything. And then in our reading from Mark, when Jesus is challenged on this topic of what is the greatest commandment, Jesus kind of cheats a little bit and has two commandments that are the greatest. And Jesus expands this somewhat to add that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves, which if you look, you can find that one in Leviticus 19. And as he's talking to these scribes and Pharisees, he says this, that these are the two commandments that are the greatest, and there's agreement. He's not saying something controversial. So at this point in Judaism, it had developed such that if you had to boil down all the law, then you could boil it down to these two commandments. And of course, that doesn't really make anything any easier. Because love is difficult. Loving with everything is difficult. Loving God is difficult. Loving our neighbors as ourselves is difficult. And so it often happens in a situation like this, because love is incredibly difficult, and because God makes it clear that God demands everything, hold nothing back, so people get quiet. And you can see that's what happens in the reading from Mark. After they have this conversation, Jesus says these are the two greatest commandments. The scribes and Pharisees agree, and that's it. No one dares ask another question, because love is hard. And when that task is sort of laid in front of you and laid bare, and you're reminded this is your task, and you think about it and you think that is a very difficult task. That's asking a lot. I don't need any extra homework after that. I'm full. And a whole life spent figuring out how to love God with everything and love our neighbors as ourselves is a life well spent. If that was all you did, that would be a life well spent. So I'm going to look at that part that Jesus adds from Leviticus 19 this morning. I'm going to look at this idea of loving neighbors as ourselves. And as we know, Jesus expands the idea of what it means to say neighbors. Right? In another gospel story, someone asks, see, they do the follow-up question that no one in this reading does. And they say, but who is my neighbor? And then Jesus tells a story about how the hated enemy for whom you feel contempt is the neighbor. And again, I believe, I didn't reread that one recently, but I believe the answer to that one is also silence. I think people hear that and they go, okay, it's way worse than I thought. I was picturing my neighbors, and my neighbors are okay. I could probably deal with them, but oh no, not Samaritans. So to expand this teaching, Jesus adds someone that his audience would feel contempt for. And this is important because when we try to love, when we seek to love, there is something that is like the enemy of love. It's like anti-love. It makes love most difficult, and if it's present in the long term, love is usually not possible. And that thing is contempt. Contempt contends against love. Love can survive a lot. Love can survive a lot of anger. Love can survive fear and anxiety. Love can survive sadness and grief. Love can survive shame. Love can survive guilt. Generally speaking, love cannot survive contempt. And so what I'd like to do is to look at contempt as it applies to our attempts to love. And it's good to start with a basic definition. Contempt is basically anger plus disgust. So anger, we're familiar with. Disgust is the feeling you feel for something that's gross. It's just, get it away from me. It's disgusting. When applied to people, disgust can be really dangerous. When applied to stuff, it can be helpful. Most things we find to be gross are bad for us, and we shouldn't touch them or eat them or any of that, right? But when we see people as disgusting, that's when it gets really dangerous. And when you take anger and you combine it with disgust, you get contempt. So, some of you are already a couple steps ahead of me here, because in our anti-racism book group, the book we are currently reading and discussing is Love Your Enemies by Arthur Brooks. And I'm not going to go into detail about the book. If you want to go into detail about it, join us for the anti-racism book group. We go into detail about all of our books, and you're welcome to join. But what Arthur Brooks talks about in his book is contempt. And he lays out some of the research that's been done on contempt. For example, if you video record a couple talking to each other for a while, and if you measure the number of times one of them shows a contempt facial expression, you can really accurately predict whether they're going to get divorced. The most accurate predictor of divorce by far is contempt. And so it's like an over 90% accuracy rate that in the next few years, this couple that is expressing contempt for one another is not going to make it. And that's where a lot of the research around contempt began. People were trying to figure out, can we predict divorce ahead of time? And can we do something about it? And what they found was, yes, we can. We just look for contempt. But Arthur Brooks he talks about that, but he's more concerned about political contempt. He perceives, and I have no disagreement, that we're currently living through an age of contempt. But especially in the last few years, it has become very common to express contempt for fellow Americans, for neighbors, even for family members. Rather than maybe in the past we might have expressed disagreement or even anger and frustration, it's recently turned to contempt. And the problem is that contempt in the short term can feel good. It can feel good to treat someone as less than us. It's a cheap way to make us feel better. It doesn't last. It's not healthy. It ruins your health and your mental health, but it feels good in the short term. So it's kind of addictive, like short-term feel-good things tend to be. It's also very successful. I'm not going to stand here and list the politicians who have been elected on a platform of contempt, but fill in the blanks yourselves. There are many of them. And it is a successful political path. If you just express contempt for your opposition, you will often win elections and defeat someone who's trying to express equanimity and, have a civil conversation and have, disagreements and deliberation. And then contempt rolls through, wins the primary, wins the election, and now that's the situation that we find ourselves in. And so Arthur Brooks has a lot to say about this. It's a thick book that goes through a lot. But one way that I would boil down what he says about how we can contend with contempt is that we need to make sure that we treat everyone with dignity. Even in disagreement, even in heated disagreement. Even when we disagree about morality, about right and wrong, we need to continue to treat other people with dignity as human beings and avoid the step that is tempting to take between you're wrong and I disagree with you and you're a piece of trash or you're vile or disgusting or we need to drive you out of society for us to be safe. That's the contempt. And in order to do that, we have to strip one another's dignity away. And so one antidote for contempt that makes it possible for us to love one another, or at least to strive for it, is to treat one another with dignity, even in disagreement. There's also relational contempt, like interpersonal, that I started with. That's where this research began. And then it expanded to look at political contempt and what people perceive as like just society is kind of falling apart. Like we can't work together very well anymore. And it seems to be going the wrong direction because of that contempt. But it begins as an interpersonal feeling. I talked about it being a predictor of divorce. Another thing that came to mind as I was working on this sermon, for some of us, me not really this year, but in the past this has been true, we might be having Thanksgiving with people from our family we don't often see. And in some cases, these might be people for whom we feel contempt or are tempted to feel contempt. Or on the other side, these might be people who habitually express contempt toward us. And I can't say this for you. This is for you to discern. But Thanksgiving is kind of a famous time of the year when we come face to face with family members who trouble us. And one of the reasons this is the case is because we may have fallen into contempt. Even more so in our interpersonal relationships and with our significant others, we may discern upon reflection that we're receiving contempt or that we even show contempt sometimes. And it can be subtle. It can be something it moves from this person forgot to do something to this person's an idiot who never does things. Like that step, that's the contempt step. The first one's a fact, you forgot to do something. The second one's a judgment. Or sometimes it comes up and you might say to someone or think, I would never do that to you. You take the moral high ground. You are under me. You're less morally developed than I am. I would never behave that way to you. Sometimes contempt comes out as truth-telling. This is one of the ways that it can be sort of addictive is you just, I'm just telling it like it is. And that is a very common cover for contemptuous behavior and contemptuous speech. There is always a way to tell it like it is without contempt. So whether you are the recipient of contempt or whether you find, I think I might be feeling and showing contempt for someone, there's something you can do to help with that. And it goes back to like communication 101. Contempt is a failure to communicate healthfully. And so what you can do, whether you're receiving some contempt or you're in the habit of giving it, you state how you're feeling, state what you want or what you need, and then importantly, the third step, invite the person to work with you. Because contempt is a zero-sum game. You're trash, I'm the winner. That's contempt. So you state your feeling. I feel mad, glad, sad, afraid. This is what I want or need, and then help me figure this out, whatever it is. Because then you're bringing the person alongside you, and now you're working together. You're a team. Even if you're not a highly functioning team, you'll get there. And this works whether you're receiving contempt or whether you're giving it. I have to add a parenthetical here. This works only if someone isn't committed to contempt. If someone is committed to contempt, that is an emotional abuser. And you do not need to be in a relationship with that person. But if someone is not committed to contempt, if they don't double down on it, then this can be a way forward. The third part has to do with, in my benediction, you may have noticed, I almost always use the same benediction, and it's because this is basically, if I leave you with one idea over a whole Sunday, this is the idea that I want to leave you with. If there's only that, fine. It's the 2 greatest commandments, so I've done my job. But I end with my benediction, and I say it a little bit differently from the way that Jesus or Leviticus says it. I say, love yourselves, your neighbors, and your enemies. The enemy part I add because Jesus does this. When we say neighbors, he doesn't just mean your next door neighbor, he means your enemy as well. And so loving your enemies is a way of saying loving your neighbors. And I add the self bit because the part as yourself in the command, love your neighbor as yourself, that part as yourself is doing a lot of work. And I like to parse that out and look at it. Because that's the part that some people struggle with the most. Love your neighbor as yourself. And for some people, loving their neighbor seems doable. Even loving an enemy is imaginable, but loving themselves, don't even touch that. It's an open wound. And then many people who do harm to their neighbors and people in their lives, it stems from an inability to love themselves, because those are connected. You can't actually love your neighbor without loving yourself. It doesn't work. It falls apart. And for some of us, this is the part that we're going to struggle with the most. Some of us struggle with being too critical or too judgmental. Some of us struggle with the inner critic. We save all of our harshest words, all of our sickest burns, we save for ourselves. And so I call that out, and I take it as a separate thing to make sure it's highlighted. There's a way that we express contempt for ourselves. They can do an incredible amount of harm and prevents us from being able to love, just as well as any of the other forms of contempt will. And there's a lot here, but one of the things that has been helpful to me and that I've shared periodically, because most people, or many people who struggle to love themselves, are outwardly very kind and loving people. I found this to be the case time and again. And so maybe you don't struggle with loving your neighbors, but you struggle with loving yourself. And so as a rule, don't say anything about yourself that you wouldn't say about someone you care about. Even if it's difficult to feel like you care about yourself, pretend. And treat yourself the way you would treat someone else you care about. So if you catch yourself telling yourself something that you wouldn't say to someone you care about out loud to their face, you have to stop. And if this becomes an ongoing practice, you bring your inner critic in line with your outer critic, and that can be a way to get past that contempt and to do that part of loving God and loving our neighbor, which is loving ourselves. There's a lot here in this sermon. I am happy to talk about these things in more depth with any of you, including those of you joining virtually. Because without knowing someone's particular situation, I can just speak in generalities and give you some advice. There's a lot more, but I don't know what it is that you're struggling with on your own. So I'm happy to speak about any of these things in more depth. But the message I want to express and have stick is that we are called to love, and love does not survive contempt. And so in order to love God with everything that we have, in order to love ourselves, our neighbors, and our enemies, one of the things we have to do is we have to be vigilant and on guard against contempt, whether we are receiving it or whether we're giving it. Amen.